When the staff of an upscale restaurant decides to neglect one of their customers because of his looks, they have no idea that the man is the owner of the establishment. How will the staff react when the truth comes out? And what will the owner decide to do to change the rules of the game? Watch to the end to find out how one act will change the fate of the entire restaurant. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new stories, and write in the comments, where are you watching from? Jonathan Price sat quietly in his office, reflecting on the journey that had brought him to where he was today. The polished mahogany desk in front of him was a far cry from the wobbly, hand-me-down furniture he had once used in his tiny apartment. His office was filled with sunlight, streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline. This was his domain now: towering skyscrapers, bustling streets, a business empire worth billions, all built with his sweat, his tears, and his relentless will. Jonathan was a self-made man, born into a working-class black family. He had grown up in a neighborhood where success was measured not by ambition, but by survival. His parents had instilled in him the value of hard work, always reminding him that the world wouldn't hand him anything because of who he was. They were right. From a young age, Jonathan had learned that the world saw his skin before it saw his capabilities. As a child, teachers had underestimated him, classmates had belittled him, and society had expected him to stay in his place. But Jonathan had never accepted that. He had worked 3 jobs to put himself through college, often pulling all-nighters to finish his studies while balancing long hours at work. Even in the corporate world, where he had climbed the ladder from a lowly intern to a successful entrepreneur, the obstacles were endless. His race often overshadowed his accomplishments. Investors would look past his qualifications, partners would make assumptions, and colleagues would second-guess his decisions. Despite the countless doors slammed in his face, Jonathan built an empire, one brick at a time. Starting with a small cafe in a rundown neighborhood, he expanded into restaurants, luxury hotels, and real estate ventures. He learned to navigate a world that wasn't designed for people like him, always one step ahead of those who sought to underestimate him. Now, he was a billionaire. He had power, influence, and respect, or so it seemed. The truth, as he had come to realize, was that even his immense success couldn't completely shield him from the prejudices that still ran deep in society. The world had changed, but not enough. Too many people still saw him as nothing more than a wealthy black man, and that distinction meant that his achievements, no matter how grand, were always second to his race in their eyes. Jonathan leaned back in his leather chair, staring out at the skyline. Today, he wasn't just another wealthy man surveying his empire. Today, he was a man on a mission. He had recently opened a new restaurant, a fine dining establishment in one of the city's most affluent neighborhoods. It was the latest addition to his growing portfolio, a symbol of his success in a sector where few people like him thrived. But Jonathan wasn't naive. He knew that despite his status as the owner, the restaurant's clientele and staff likely wouldn't treat him any differently from the way they treated any other black man walking through the door, especially one dressed as he intended to be today. He glanced at the plain clothes he had laid out on the couch in his office. A simple pair of jeans, a faded t-shirt, and a pair of sneakers. The look was a far cry from his usual tailored suits and expensive watches, but that was the point. Today, he wasn't going in as Jonathan Price, the billionaire entrepreneur. Today, he was just a regular man, walking into his own establishment to see how the staff would treat someone who didn't look the part. He stood up and began changing out of his business attire. As he buttoned up his shirt, his thoughts drifted back to a few recent incidents. Even with his wealth, there were moments when he had been reminded, sometimes subtly, sometimes blatantly, that for many, he was still just a black man first and foremost. Whether it was the lingering gazes in high-end stores or the tone-deaf comments at elite social events, Jonathan knew that beneath the surface of his success, society still held on to its deep-rooted biases. But today wasn't about confrontation. It was about observation. Jonathan wanted to see his restaurant through the eyes of an ordinary customer, someone who wasn't automatically granted respect due to their appearance. Would his staff live up to the high standards he had set? Or would they fail to recognize that every guest, regardless of their appearance, deserved the same level of service? With a final glance in the mirror, Jonathan pocketed his keys and phone. He looked like an average guy now, not the head of a billion-dollar empire. That was exactly how he wanted it. The restaurant was one of his proudest accomplishments. Situated in a bustling, upscale part of town, it had become a hotspot for the city's elite. Known for its exquisite menu and luxurious ambiance, it catered to politicians, celebrities, and high-powered executives. The decor was designed to exude opulence: polished marble floors, gold-trimmed chandeliers, and velvet-lined booths that offered privacy to the wealthy patrons who frequented the establishment. As Jonathan approached the entrance, he couldn't help but admire the exterior. The facade, lined with modern glass and stone, shimmered in the late afternoon sun. It was the kind of place that screamed exclusivity, where reservations were made weeks in advance, and where service was supposed to be impeccable. Jonathan had invested millions into ensuring that every detail, from the lighting to the menu, was perfect. He took a deep breath and stepped inside. The moment the heavy glass door closed behind him, the ambiance changed. Soft music played in the background, blending with the gentle hum of quiet conversations. The scent of gourmet dishes wafted through the air, tantalizing but subtle, meant to enhance the experience rather than overwhelm it. Jonathan scanned the room quickly, taking in the layout. A few couples sat in the plush booths along the walls, while a small group of business people occupied a table in the center of the room, deep in conversation. Every table was adorned with elegant silverware, delicate flower arrangements, and flickering candles. It was everything he had envisioned when he first dreamed of this place. Yet, almost immediately, he felt the shift in the atmosphere. As he made his way toward the Hostess stand, he noticed the glances. A few patrons turned their heads briefly, their eyes scanning him before quickly returning to their meals. But it was the staff who concerned him more. The hostess, a young woman in her mid-20s with a perfectly tailored uniform, was busy adjusting the reservation list when he approached. She glanced up briefly, then did a double-take, her expression shifting from polite indifference to something more guarded. "Good evening," Jonathan said calmly, giving her a warm smile. "I was hoping to get a table." The hostess blinked, momentarily taken aback. She glanced down at her list, then up at Jonathan again, her eyes flickering with something he recognized all too well: judgment. "I'm sorry, sir," she said after a brief pause, her tone cool and rehearsed. "We're fully booked tonight." Jonathan raised an eyebrow, glancing around the restaurant. He could see at least 3 empty tables, and while he knew that many high-end establishments kept some tables reserved for VIPs or unexpected guests, there was no denying the subtle hostility in her voice. "All the tables are reserved?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. "Yes, sir. We're completely full." He could tell she wasn't going to budge. Jonathan had dealt with this before, being dismissed, ignored, underestimated. He'd heard the excuses, the polite lies, the subtle ways people in service industries used to push aside those they deemed unworthy. But he had expected better from his own staff. His temples throbbed with frustration, but he reminded himself of the reason he was here, to see how they would treat a man they thought was just another customer, not their boss. "Thank you," he said, calmly, stepping aside. He moved to the corner of the room, standing by a large window, pretending to check his phone. Out of the corner of his eye, he watched as the hostess whispered something to a nearby waiter, who glanced at Jonathan before shaking his head. It was subtle, but he could feel the tension building. He was being sized up, judged, dismissed, all because of the way he looked. A few minutes later, another couple walked through the door, dressed in designer clothing, their appearance screaming wealth and status. The hostess greeted them with a beaming smile and immediately led them to one of the tables Jonathan had noticed earlier. He sighed, shaking his head slightly. It was exactly what he had feared. Jonathan stood there for a few more moments, watching the scene unfold around him. He could feel the weight of the stares from both the staff and the patrons, their silent judgments hanging in the air. They didn't know who he was, but they had already decided what he was. Someone who didn't belong. This wasn't new to him. He had felt this his entire life, no matter how successful he became. The world always found a way to remind him of where it thought he belonged. As he stood by the window, the subtle hum of the restaurant buzzing around him, Jonathan knew that this wasn't just about getting a table. This was about something much deeper, something that would need to be addressed, but not yet. First, he would observe, then he would act. But tonight was far from over. With his mind racing and his heart heavy, Jonathan decided to remain in the restaurant a little longer. He wanted to see how far the staff would take their dismissal of him, and whether anyone would offer even a semblance of proper service. He wasn't just a guest here. He was testing the very foundation of his business philosophy, one that was supposed to be built on respect and equality. For now, though, Jonathan waited, observing the room around him, knowing that soon things would change, but not before they got much worse. Jonathan stood by the window, phone in hand, watching the evening unfold around him. The warm glow of chandeliers bathed the restaurant in an amber light, soft and inviting, but there was a sharp contrast between the ambiance and the tension growing within him. The situation was playing out exactly as he had feared, yet seeing it firsthand still stung. The quiet murmurs of diners, the clinking of silverware, the attentive staff bustling between tables. It was a picture of luxury and refinement. But underneath it all, Jonathan knew better. He shifted his weight, pretending to scroll through his phone, but his mind was elsewhere. The hostess continued to smile warmly at the guests who looked the part, leading them to tables without a second thought. Jonathan's heart sank a little deeper with each passing minute. It wasn't just about being denied service. It was the message behind it, the implicit understanding that someone like him, dressed as he was, couldn't possibly belong in a place like this. Jonathan knew he needed to maintain his composure. There was a larger plan at work, and blowing up at the staff or causing a scene wouldn't achieve his goals. But the rising frustration gnawed at him. He had built this restaurant from the ground up, and now he was being treated like an outsider in his own creation. Worse yet, it wasn't because of anything he had done, but simply because of how he looked. Taking a deep breath, Jonathan decided to give them one more chance. He walked back toward the hostess stand, his steps deliberate but calm, as if he hadn't just been quietly seething a few moments earlier. The hostess didn't notice him at first. She was too busy attending to another well-dressed couple who had just entered the restaurant, offering them the same bright smile and swift service she had denied him. But when Jonathan cleared his throat softly, she finally glanced his way, her expression immediately cooling. "Yes?" she asked, her tone crisp, as if annoyed that he had dared to approach her again. Jonathan remained polite, though he could feel his patience wearing thin. "I noticed that a few tables have opened up," he said evenly, gesturing to the now vacant spots. "Are any of those available?" The hostess blinked, glancing toward the empty tables he had pointed out. For a moment, she seemed to consider her response, as if weighing her options, before she shook her head. "Unfortunately, those tables are reserved for VIP guests," she said, her tone laced with finality. "We can't offer them to walk-ins." Jonathan's jaw clenched, though he kept his face neutral. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was the VIP guest here, the very person responsible for this restaurant's existence. But to her, he was just another man who didn't belong. He could have revealed his identity right then, could have dropped his name and watched her backtrack in embarrassment. But that wasn't why he had come. This was about more than his own ego. "I understand," he said after a pause, though the words tasted bitter. "But I'd like to wait for a table, if that's all right." The hostess glanced around, as if searching for someone else to deal with him. When no one came to her rescue, she sighed. "You're welcome to wait, but like I said, we're fully booked for the night." Jonathan nodded, stepping aside again. He could feel the stares from the other guests, the way they glanced at him with curiosity and, in some cases, thinly veiled disdain. One of the businessmen seated nearby leaned over to his companion, whispering something that drew a snicker. Jonathan ignored it, but the weight of their judgment settled heavy in his chest. As he stood there, trying to maintain his calm, the situation escalated. One of the waiters, an older man with a neatly trimmed mustache and a stiff posture, approached the hostess, whispering something in her ear. They both glanced briefly in Jonathan's direction, before the waiter made his way over. "Excuse me, sir," the waiter said, his voice clipped. "Is there something we can help you with?" Jonathan turned to face him, keeping his expression calm. "I'm just waiting for a table." The waiter raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "As the hostess mentioned, we're fully booked for the evening. Perhaps you'd like to try a different night?" The implication was clear. They didn't want him here. Not tonight. Not ever. Unless he conformed to whatever unspoken expectations they had for their clientele. Jonathan felt his patience waning, the injustice of the situation gnawing at him. He could understand busy nights and full reservations, but the way they dismissed him without a second thought, without even trying to accommodate him, was a slap in the face. "I don't mind waiting," Jonathan repeated, his voice steady but firm. The waiter didn't respond right away. Instead, he glanced back at the hostess, as if seeking confirmation. When she gave a slight nod, the waiter sighed, as though Jonathan's mere presence was an inconvenience they had no choice but to tolerate. "Well, if you insist," the waiter said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Feel free to wait, but we can't guarantee anything." Jonathan nodded, though his mind was racing. This wasn't just poor service. It was discrimination, plain and simple. They had sized him up the moment he walked through the door and decided that he wasn't worthy of the same treatment they gave their other guests. And while he had experienced this kind of prejudice countless times in his life, it didn't sting any less. As the waiter walked away, Jonathan found himself standing alone once again, the ambient noise of the restaurant buzzing around him like static. He could feel the tension building in his chest, the slow burn of frustration giving way to a deeper, more personal anger. He had worked too hard, overcome too much, to be treated like this in his own establishment. Just as Jonathan was considering whether to leave or continue his silent protest, another man entered the restaurant. This man, white, tall, and sharply dressed in a tailored suit, was greeted with immediate enthusiasm. The hostess, who had been so cold and dismissive with Jonathan, now smiled brightly, welcoming the new arrival with open arms. "Good evening, Mr. Williams," she said cheerfully. "We have your table ready for you." Jonathan watched as the man, clearly a regular, was escorted to one of the prime tables in the center of the room, the same table that the hostess had claimed was reserved for VIPs. The ease with which Mr. Williams was seated, the way the staff bent over backward to make him comfortable, only deepened Jonathan's sense of injustice. But the final straw came when the restaurant manager arrived. Jonathan recognized him instantly. Mark Williams, the restaurant's general manager. A middle-aged white man with graying hair and a perpetually smug expression. Williams had been hired to oversee day-to-day operations when the restaurant first opened. Jonathan had personally approved his hiring, impressed by his resume and credentials. But now, watching Williams interact with Mr. Williams, laughing and shaking hands as if they were old friends, Jonathan felt a wave of disappointment and anger wash over him. This was the man responsible for ensuring that the restaurant ran smoothly. The man Jonathan had trusted to uphold the values of his brand. Yet here he was, blatantly ignoring Jonathan's presence while fawning over another customer. Jonathan's fists clenched at his sides, his knuckles turning white. He was on the verge of stepping forward, of confronting Williams, and demanding an explanation, when the manager finally noticed him. Williams' eyes narrowed as he approached, his gaze quickly assessing Jonathan's casual attire. The recognition didn't seem to register at first, and when it finally did, it was clear that Williams didn't quite know what to make of it. "Can I help you?" Williams asked, his tone polite but detached, as if speaking to someone far below his station. Jonathan took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. "I've been waiting for a table," he said, keeping his voice steady, "but I've been told the restaurant is fully booked." Williams blinked, momentarily caught off guard. He glanced around the room, clearly aware of the empty tables that had opened up. But instead of addressing the issue, he simply shrugged. "I'm afraid that's correct," Williams said, his voice dripping with insincerity. "We have a very exclusive clientele, and most of our tables are reserved well in advance. Perhaps another evening would be more suitable." Jonathan's eyes narrowed. The dismissal was so casual, so calculated, that it took every ounce of restraint not to lash out. Instead, he met Williams' gaze with a cold, measured stare. "Are you sure about that?" Jonathan asked, his voice low but steady. Williams faltered for a moment, clearly unsure of how to respond. But before he could say anything more, another staff member appeared at his side, whispering something in his ear. Whatever was said seemed to set Williams on edge, and Jonathan watched as the manager's expression shifted from smug indifference to something closer to alarm. Williams straightened, clearing his throat. "Actually, I may have been mistaken," he said quickly. "We might have a table opening up after all, but the damage was already done." Jonathan didn't need their apologies or their backpedaling. He had seen enough. He stepped back, his voice calm but firm. "Thank you, but I'll be leaving now." With that, Jonathan turned and walked toward the exit, the weight of their stares heavy on his back. As he reached the door, he paused, glancing back one final time. "This isn't over," he said softly, but his words carried a quiet certainty that sent a chill through the room. The staff didn't know it yet, but their world was about to change. Jonathan's footsteps echoed in the quiet alley as he left the restaurant behind. The soft hum of the city's nightlife buzzed around him, but his mind was elsewhere, locked on the events that had just unfolded. His frustration boiled beneath the surface, threatening to burst. But years of experience had taught him restraint. He had learned to channel his anger into action, and tonight would be no different. As he walked, Jonathan replayed the encounter in his head. The hostess's smug attitude, the waiter's condescending tone, the manager's cold dismissal. It was all too familiar. He had lived through this countless times before, in various forms, in different places. But it never got easier. It never became something he could brush off. Each time, it stung the same. Each time, it reminded him that no matter how successful he became, no matter how much wealth or power he accumulated, the world would still see him as less. Jonathan stopped at a corner, the soft glow of streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement. He stood there for a moment, his mind racing, the weight of the evening settling heavily on his shoulders. He had tried to remain calm, to handle the situation with grace, but he couldn't deny the growing anger inside him, not just at the staff's behavior, but at the system that allowed it to persist. He had built his empire on the belief that hard work and perseverance could overcome anything. But the truth was more complicated. The world was still governed by biases and prejudices that no amount of success could erase. And tonight, he had been reminded of that harsh reality in a way that felt deeply personal. Jonathan took a deep breath, closing his eyes for a moment to steady himself. He couldn't let this slide. He had worked too hard, come too far to allow this kind of treatment to continue, especially in one of his own establishments. This wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had ever been treated like he was tonight. His mind was already formulating a plan. He would go back. Not tonight, but soon. And this time, he wouldn't go as an anonymous guest. He would return as Jonathan Price, billionaire entrepreneur, owner of the restaurant. And when he did, there would be consequences. But first, there was something else that needed to be addressed. The next morning, Jonathan sat at his desk, surrounded by his team of lawyers and advisors. The mood in the room was tense as they reviewed the events of the previous night. But Jonathan remained calm, his face a mask of quiet determination. "This is unacceptable," Jonathan said, his voice steady but firm. "The way they treated me, treated any guest, is not something I'm going to tolerate in any of my establishments." His lead attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Grace, nodded. "We've already started looking into the situation," she said, flipping through a stack of papers. "The staff involved, especially the manager, will face immediate disciplinary action. We can terminate their contracts by the end of the week." Jonathan shook his head. "That's not enough," he said. "Firing them won't fix the problem. We need to address the culture that allows this kind of behavior to exist in the first place." Grace frowned, glancing at the others in the room. "What do you have in mind?" she asked cautiously. Jonathan leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "I want to buy out the restaurant," he said, his tone resolute. "I already own a controlling stake, but I want full ownership. Once that's done, we'll implement new policies, mandatory training for all staff on how to treat customers with respect, regardless of their appearance or background. And anyone who can't get on board with that will be let go." The room fell silent for a moment, as everyone processed Jonathan's words. It was an ambitious plan, but no one was surprised. Jonathan had always been known for his decisive, bold moves. Grace cleared her throat. "We can start drafting the paperwork today," she said, her pen poised over her notepad. "But I'll need your approval for the buyout terms." Jonathan nodded. "Do it." As his team set to work, Jonathan sat back in his chair, feeling a sense of satisfaction. This was how he fought back, through action, through change. He wouldn't allow the prejudices of a few small-minded individuals to tarnish what he had built. And if that meant cleaning house, so be it. 2 days later, Jonathan found himself standing outside the restaurant once again, but this time things were different. He wasn't dressed in casual clothes. Instead, he wore a sleek, tailored suit that exuded power and authority. His presence alone commanded attention, and as he stepped through the restaurant's doors, he could feel the shift in energy. The hostess, the same woman from 2 nights ago, looked up as he approached. Her eyes widened in recognition, and she immediately straightened her posture, her earlier indifference replaced by a nervous smile. "Good evening, sir," she said quickly, clearly trying to regain her composure. "Welcome back. We have a table ready for you." Jonathan said nothing at first, simply watching her squirm under his gaze. It was obvious that she remembered him, and now that she knew who he was, her entire demeanor had changed. But that wasn't enough. She was only treating him with respect because of his status, not because it was the right thing to do. "I see you've decided to acknowledge me this time," Jonathan said evenly, his voice calm, but with an edge that made her flinch. The hostess stammered, clearly flustered. I apologize for the misunderstanding the other night, sir. I didn't realize." Jonathan held up a hand, cutting her off. "That's the problem," he said, his eyes cold. "You didn't realize who I was, so you treated me like I didn't belong. And that's exactly why we're having this conversation." The hostess swallowed hard, clearly unsure of what to say. Jonathan could see the panic in her eyes, but he had no intention of sparing her the uncomfortable truth. This was about more than her. It was about the entire system that allowed this kind of behavior to thrive. "Where's your manager?" Jonathan asked after a moment, his voice steady. "He's in the back," the hostess said quickly. "I can get him for you." Jonathan nodded. "Do that." As the hostess scurried off to fetch the manager, Jonathan took a moment to survey the restaurant. It was early in the evening, so the place wasn't too crowded yet, but he could already feel the eyes of the few guests who were present. They recognized him, of course. In his tailored suit, with his confident demeanor, Jonathan Price was a man who commanded attention. But tonight, he wasn't here to bask in their admiration. He was here to right a wrong. A few minutes later, the restaurant manager, Mark Williams, emerged from the back, his face a mask of forced calm. But Jonathan could see the nervousness in his eyes, the way his hands fidgeted at his sides. "Mr. Price," Williams said with a tight smile, "I wasn't expecting to see you here tonight." Jonathan crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. Clearly, Williams shifted uncomfortably, glancing around the restaurant as if looking for an escape. But there was none. He was cornered, and he knew it. "I understand there was a bit of a misunderstanding the other night," Williams said, his voice strained. "I assure you, it was never our intention to—" "Stop," Jonathan said sharply, his voice cutting through Williams' excuses like a knife. "I don't need your apologies. What I need is for you to explain why my staff, thought it was acceptable to treat a guest the way I was treated 2 nights ago." Williams swallowed hard, clearly caught off guard by Jonathan's directness. "Sir, Don't lie to me," Jonathan interrupted, his tone cold and unforgiving. "You knew exactly what was happening that night. You saw it with your own eyes, and you did nothing to stop it. In fact, you encouraged it." William's face paled, and he took a small step back. I didn't realize." "You didn't realize because you didn't care," Jonathan said, his voice growing harder with each word. "You saw a man you thought didn't belong, and you made a decision based on that. And that's why we're here." Williams said nothing, his face a mask of fear and regret. He knew he was finished. Jonathan took a deep breath, his gaze never leaving Williams' face. "I'm giving you one chance," he said quietly. "One chance to explain to me why you think you should keep your job after what happened." Williams opened his mouth, but no words came out. He was floundering, struggling to find an answer that wouldn't condemn him further. But there was none. The truth was plain for everyone to see. "I'm waiting," Jonathan said after a long moment, his tone deadly serious. William stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I made a mistake." Jonathan's eyes narrowed. "A mistake?" Williams nodded quickly, desperation creeping into his voice. "Yes, sir. It was a mistake. I should have handled the situation better. I should have made sure that all our guests were treated with respect. Regardless of what?" Jonathan cut in, his voice icy. "Regardless of whether they look like they belong?" Williams flinched but said nothing. Jonathan let out a slow breath, his gaze hard and unyielding. "You're fired." Williams' eyes widened in shock. "Sir, please, You're done," Jonathan repeated, his tone final. "Clean out your office by the end of the day. I don't want to see you here again." Williams stood there for a moment, as if frozen in place, before nodding weakly. "Yes, sir," he said quietly, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Jonathan watched as the former manager turned and walked back toward the kitchen, his steps slow and heavy. The restaurant fell into a tense silence, the staff and patrons watching with wide eyes as the scene unfolded. No one dared to speak. Jonathan stood there for a moment, letting the weight of his decision sink in. Williams' firing was only the beginning. There were going to be more changes, sweeping changes. The culture of this restaurant, and every restaurant he owned, would change, and it would start today. The conflict had reached its peak, but Jonathan knew that the battle was far from over. There were still challenges ahead, still more work to be done. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of control. He wasn't just reacting to the world's injustices anymore. He was shaping it. And as he stood in the middle of his restaurant, the staff and patrons looking on in stunned silence, Jonathan knew that this was just the beginning. Jonathan stood in the middle of his restaurant, the echoes of his last words still hanging in the air like a tangible weight. Mark Williams had disappeared into the back, his figure sagging with defeat, and the restaurant staff stood frozen, unsure of what would come next. Even the patrons, who had been quietly enjoying their meals, now looked up with interest, their conversations hushed, as they sensed the tension thickening in the air. The restaurant had become more than just a place of business. It had become the battlefield where Jonathan was about to make his stand. But for now, he needed to regroup. The firing of Mark Williams was only the first step in a much larger plan, one that would ripple far beyond this one establishment. With a final glance around the room, Jonathan nodded to himself and left without another word. The next phase of his plan required careful thought, and for that he needed the quiet of his office. Back at his office, Jonathan settled behind his desk, his fingers drumming thoughtfully against the dark wood surface. The sleek, modern space around him was a stark contrast to the tension-filled atmosphere of the restaurant. The floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city skyline. But today, Jonathan's focus was turned inward. He reached for his phone and dialed Grace, his lead attorney. As the line rang, he thought about the next steps. The situation at the restaurant had escalated, but Jonathan knew that solving the issue there was only a small part of what needed to happen. This was bigger than a few dismissive employees. It was about changing an entire system, an entire mindset. "Jonathan?" Grace answered, her voice sharp and professional, as always. "Grace, I need you to start working on the paperwork for a full buyout of the restaurant," Jonathan said without preamble. "I want complete control over the place. No more partners. I also want to draft new policies for the entire staff, not just at this location, but at every establishment in the chain. Cultural sensitivity training, mandatory for everyone, from the hostess to the kitchen staff." Grace was quiet for a moment, processing the request. "That's a significant shift in management structure," she finally replied. "And it could come with some pushback." especially from long-standing staff members. You know how entrenched some of these attitudes can be. Jonathan sighed. I'm aware, but that's exactly why it needs to be done. We can't afford to have another incident like the one that happened to me. And I'm not just talking about myself. It's about anyone who walks through those doors. They need to feel welcome, no matter who they are or what they look like. Grace's voice softened slightly. I get it. I'll start drafting the necessary documents and work with HR on the training programs. But it's going to be a long process. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling as his mind raced with the possibilities and the challenges. I know, but we'll get it done. Keep me updated. He ended the call and tossed his phone on the desk, rubbing his temples. This was the part of the fight that was less visible, but just as important. Changing policies, enforcing new standards, shifting mindsets. None of it would be easy, but it was necessary. He couldn't stop thinking about how the restaurant staff had treated him. Not just the indifference, but the outright hostility and the casual way they had dismissed him as though he was insignificant. It wasn't just about race. It was about respect. And if his employees couldn't offer basic decency to every person who walked through the door, then they had no place working for him. Jonathan's thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. His assistant, Maya, poked her head in. Sir, your finance team is ready to discuss the buyout terms for the restaurant, she said. Jonathan nodded, gesturing for her to let them in. The meeting with his finance team was brief, but it solidified the first concrete step in his plan. By the end of the week, the restaurant would be fully under his control, and once the paperwork was finalized, he would have the authority to implement the sweeping changes he had envisioned. But this was just the beginning. The real challenge would come when he returned to the restaurant to deliver the news. There would be pushback. There always was when power dynamics shifted, and he wasn't naive enough to think that everyone would embrace the changes with open arms. The day of Jonathan's return to the restaurant arrived quickly, and as he walked through the front doors, the atmosphere felt markedly different from the last time he had been there. The restaurant was fuller tonight, a mix of regular patrons and new faces, some of whom recognized him immediately. But Jonathan wasn't here for the patrons. He was here for the staff. He had already made the necessary arrangements with HR and the legal team. The buyout was complete, and now he was ready to put his new policies into place. He strode past the Hostess stand without a word, making his way to the back office where the staff had been gathered for a mandatory meeting. As he approached the door, the low murmur of voices inside quieted, and when he entered, all eyes were on him. The room was packed with employees, waiters, kitchen staff, bartenders, and managers. Jonathan could feel the tension thick in the air. They knew why he was here. They had heard about Mark Williams' firing, and many of them feared what was coming next. Jonathan stood at the front of the room, his posture relaxed but authoritative. He let the silence linger for a moment, allowing the weight of the situation to settle over the room before he spoke. "Good evening," he began, his voice steady. "I'm sure most of you are aware of why we're here tonight. Some of you have probably heard rumors about changes coming to the restaurant, and I'm here to confirm those rumors." A ripple of uncertainty moved through the room, but Jonathan continued. "I've recently bought out the restaurant, which means I now have full ownership. As the new sole owner, I want to make one thing very clear. The kind of behavior that I witnessed here 2 nights ago will not be tolerated, not just in this location, but in any establishment that bears my name." He let his words sink in, watching as the staff shifted uncomfortably. Some looked defiant, others anxious, but they were all listening. "Effective immediately, we will be implementing new policies that ensure every guest who walks through our doors is treated with the respect they deserve," Jonathan said, his tone firm but measured. That includes mandatory cultural sensitivity training for all staff members, as well as stricter guidelines on how we interact with our customers. One of the waiters, a man in his mid-30s with a defensive look in his eyes, raised his hand. "What exactly are you saying?" he asked, his voice edged with frustration. "That we can't choose who we serve anymore? That we have to treat everyone like they're special?" Jonathan turned to face him, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "I'm saying that if you can't treat every person who walks into this restaurant with dignity and respect, then you don't belong here." The waiter's face reddened, and he opened his mouth to argue, but Jonathan raised a hand to stop him. "This isn't up for debate," Jonathan said calmly. "These policies aren't suggestions. They're requirements. If you have a problem with that, you're free to leave. No one is forcing you to work here. But if you stay, you will follow the new guidelines, or you will be let go." The room fell into an uneasy silence as the weight of Jonathan's words sank in. No one spoke, but the tension in the air was palpable. Jonathan knew that some of them would resist the changes, and he was prepared for that. There would be those who clung to their old ways of thinking, who didn't see anything wrong with the way things had been. But Jonathan also knew that change wasn't about immediate compliance. It was about setting a new standard and sticking to it, no matter the cost. As the meeting ended, Jonathan stood at the door, watching as the staff filtered out one by one. Some avoided his gaze, clearly uncomfortable with the new direction the restaurant was taking. Others nodded respectfully as they passed, perhaps understanding that this was a necessary change, even if they didn't like it. Jonathan caught sight of the waiter who had challenged him earlier, and for a moment, their eyes met. The man hesitated, as if considering saying something, but ultimately decided against it and walked out of the room in silence. Later that night, as the restaurant began to fill with patrons, Jonathan remained in the background, observing. The changes wouldn't happen overnight, but tonight was the start of something new. He had already seen a subtle shift in the way the staff interacted with the guests, though it was clear that some were still adjusting. Jonathan knew it would take time. Changing a culture that had been in place for years didn't happen with the snap of a finger. But as he watched a hostess warmly greet a young black couple who had just walked in, something that might not have happened before, he felt a small sense of accomplishment. This was what he had fought for, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever walked into a room and been judged unfairly because of how they looked. It wasn't just about business anymore. It was about setting a new standard, one that could ripple outward, affecting more than just his restaurants. The battle wasn't over. There would be resistance, and there would be setbacks. But for now, Jonathan was content knowing that he had taken the first step. The fight for respect and equality was far from over, but tonight, at least, it had begun. The restaurant's atmosphere had shifted since Jonathan's return. What had once been a haven for the city's elite, where the staff catered only to those who looked the part, now teetered on the edge of transformation. The staff knew that changes were coming, changes they couldn't avoid, and although many of them were reluctant, the undeniable presence of Jonathan Price, their new sole owner, hung over them like a storm cloud, threatening to upend everything they had grown comfortable with. But tonight would be the true test. Jonathan had made it clear that the standards were changing. He had fired the manager, Mark Williams, the man who had fostered an environment of exclusivity and disdain for anyone who didn't fit into the narrow mold of the restaurant's ideal clientele. But firing Williams had only been the beginning. The real battle was yet to come. That evening, Jonathan called for a staff meeting. The entire restaurant staff was expected to attend, from the waiters to the kitchen crew. Jonathan knew that the time had come to confront the toxic culture that had been festering within the restaurant. He wasn't going to allow this place, his place, to continue functioning as a bastion of elitism and prejudice. His goal was to create a space where everyone, regardless of their appearance, race, or background, felt respected and valued. The meeting was held after hours, once the last patron had left for the night. The dining room, usually buzzing with the soft murmur of conversations and the clinking of silverware, now stood eerily silent. The staff gathered nervously, whispering among themselves as they took their places, their eyes darting toward Jonathan, who stood at the front of the room, arms crossed. Jonathan scanned the room, his gaze steady and unflinching. He could see the uncertainty in their faces, the tension in the way they stood. Some of them looked defiant, others anxious, but all of them were waiting for him to speak. He began slowly, his voice low but commanding. "You all know why we're here," he said, his eyes sweeping the room. "Things are going to change around here, and I need to make sure you all understand exactly what that means." He paused, letting the silence stretch, before continuing. This restaurant was built on the idea that every customer, every guest who walks through those doors, deserves to be treated with respect. That's not just a slogan. It's the foundation of everything we do, or at least it should be. A few staff members shifted uncomfortably, clearly sensing where the conversation was heading. "But the truth is," Jonathan continued, his voice hardening, "that hasn't been happening. I've seen it with my own eyes. People, good people, have walked in here, only to be treated like they don't belong, like they're not worthy of being served, and I won't stand for that." Jonathan could feel the tension rising in the room, but he pressed on. "What happened to me the other night isn't just about me. It's about anyone who's ever been judged because of how they look, how they dress, or the color of their skin. And I refuse to let this restaurant be a place where that kind of behavior is tolerated." He took a breath, locking eyes with several of the staff members who had been involved in the incident. "That's why we're implementing new policies. Starting today, this restaurant is going to operate on a new standard. There will be mandatory training for all staff, cultural sensitivity training, respect training, you name it. You're going to learn how to treat every customer who walks through those doors with the dignity they deserve. And if you can't get on board with that, you won't have a place here." A murmur rippled through the crowd, and one of the waiters, the same man who had challenged him in the last meeting, raised his hand. Jonathan nodded, allowing him to speak. "Look, Mr. Price," the waiter began, his tone careful but defensive. "I get what you're trying to do here, but don't you think this is a bit extreme? I mean, we've been running this place fine for years. The customers who come here expect a certain standard. You start letting anyone in, and it's going to ruin the vibe. People come here because it's exclusive." Jonathan's jaw clenched, but he kept his tone measured. "Exclusive doesn't mean discriminatory," he said firmly. "It doesn't mean turning away people based on assumptions. You think the restaurant will lose its appeal if we treat everyone with respect? You think wealthy people will stop coming here because they have to share a dining room with someone who doesn't fit into your idea of who belongs?" The waiter shifted uncomfortably, but didn't respond. Jonathan continued, his voice gaining momentum. "If that's the case, then this restaurant isn't as great as I thought it was. Because any place that prides itself on exclusivity based on race, appearance, or wealth is doomed to fail. We're not here to serve only the rich or the well-dressed. We're here to serve anyone who values quality food, good service, and respect." He paused, scanning the faces of the staff. "And if you can't understand that, then this isn't the place for you." Another hand went up. This time, one of the senior waitresses, a woman who had worked at the restaurant since its opening. "What about the regulars?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. "We've got customers who've been coming here for years. They expect a certain experience. and if we change things too much, we might lose them." Jonathan nodded, understanding her concern. "I'm not saying we're going to stop providing great service," he replied. "In fact, I'm saying the opposite. Our service is going to get better because we're going to treat every customer like they're worth our best effort. We're not lowering our standards. We're raising them." The room fell silent again, the staff processing his words. Jonathan could see the wheels turning in their minds, some of them resisting, others perhaps starting to understand. But he knew that this wasn't going to be an easy transition. Changing a culture that had been in place for years didn't happen overnight. There would be resistance, and some of the staff would likely quit rather than adapt. But Jonathan was prepared for that. "This isn't about taking anything away," Jonathan continued. "It's about building something better. We can still be the best restaurant in the city, but we can't be the best if we're excluding people. We can't be the best if we're looking down on our customers. That's not who we are. At least, it's not who I want us to be." Another murmur went through the crowd, but this time it was less of a protest and more of a thoughtful discussion. Some of the staff were nodding, perhaps beginning to see Jonathan's vision for the future of the restaurant. Others still looked skeptical, but that was to be expected. Jonathan took a step back, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. He had said what needed to be said. Now, it was up to them to decide how they would move forward. Over the next few weeks, the restaurant underwent a transformation. The staff attended mandatory training sessions, learning how to provide top-tier service to every guest, regardless of who they were or what they looked like. Some employees quit, unable or unwilling to adapt to the new standards, but Jonathan wasn't bothered by their departure. In fact, he saw it as a necessary step in cleansing the toxic culture that had taken root in the restaurant. The training sessions were intense, focusing not only on customer service, but also on understanding unconscious bias, recognizing the ways in which small actions could make guests feel unwelcome or judged. Jonathan attended a few of the sessions himself, sitting quietly in the back as he observed the staff's reactions. Some were fully engaged, eager to learn and improve. Others, he could tell, were simply going through the motions, waiting for the mandatory sessions to end so they could return to their old habits. But Jonathan wasn't going to let that happen. He had made it clear that the changes were permanent, and anyone who refused to adhere to the new standards would be let go. One evening, after the restaurant had closed, Jonathan gathered the remaining staff for another meeting. He could feel the shift in the air. There was still resistance, but it was quieter now, more subtle. The staff had begun to realize that Jonathan wasn't backing down, and slowly but surely, they were starting to fall in line. "Tonight," Jonathan began, his voice firm, "I want to recognize the efforts you've all made over the past few weeks. I know this hasn't been easy, and I know that change can be uncomfortable, but I've seen the progress you're making, and I want to acknowledge that." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But we're not done yet. There's still work to be done. The changes we're making aren't just about following a checklist. They're about creating a new culture, one that treats every guest with the respect and dignity they deserve. That's not something that happens overnight. It's something we have to commit to every single day." The staff listened quietly, their expressions thoughtful. Jonathan could tell that some of them were finally starting to understand the bigger picture. This wasn't just about the restaurant. It was about something much larger. It was about creating a space where people felt welcome, regardless of who they were. "There's one more thing," Jonathan said, his voice softening slightly. "I want you to understand why this is so important to me. I know that for some of you, it might seem like just another corporate policy. But for me, this is personal. Because I've been on the other side. I've walked into places and been treated like I didn't belong. And I won't allow that to happen here. Not in a place that bears my name." The room fell silent, the weight of Jonathan's words hanging in the air. For the first time, the staff seemed to fully grasp the depth of what he was trying to do. "We're not just running a restaurant," Jonathan said quietly. "We're setting an example. And that example starts with how we treat every single person who walks through those doors." The following weeks brought more changes. New staff members were hired, many of whom had experienced discrimination themselves and understood the importance of Jonathan's vision. The restaurant slowly began to transform, not just in terms of service, but in its overall atmosphere. Guests of all backgrounds started to fill the dining room, and the staff, those who remained, began to rise to the occasion. The once tense and exclusive environment became warmer, more welcoming. Word of the changes spread, and the restaurant began to attract a more diverse clientele, many of whom came because they had heard about Jonathan's commitment to creating an inclusive space. One evening, as Jonathan walked through the dining room, observing the smooth operations, he felt a sense of pride. The journey had been difficult, and there had been moments when he wasn't sure the staff would ever fully accept the new standards. But now, seeing the way they interacted with the guests, he knew it had been worth it. He paused near a table where a young black couple sat, laughing and enjoying their meal. They had been greeted warmly by the hostess, seated without hesitation, and were now being served by one of the waiters who had initially resisted the changes. Jonathan watched as the waiter smiled and joked with them, treating them with the same level of respect and care that he would offer to any other guest. Jonathan's heart swelled with pride. This was what he had fought for. The restaurant was no longer just a place for the elite. It was a place for everyone. And for Jonathan, that was the real victory. The transformation of the restaurant had been slow but steady. It wasn't just the decor that had changed, or even the menu, though both had been subtly adjusted to better reflect the new philosophy Jonathan was trying to instill. No, the real change had been deeper, something almost imperceptible to the casual observer. It was in the way the staff moved through the space, the way they greeted every guest with genuine warmth, the way they now served with pride instead of indifference. There was a shift in the air, a quiet revolution that had taken hold in the hearts and minds of those who worked within the restaurant's walls. Jonathan stood at the edge of the dining room, observing the flow of the evening. It was a busy night, as it often was now, but this time the guests were more varied than ever before. Couples of all races and backgrounds filled the tables, families laughed over shared meals, and friends raised glasses in toasts, their conversations blending into the soft hum of the evening. The restaurant, once known for its exclusivity, was now a place where everyone felt welcome, where the barriers of status and appearance had been dissolved in favor of a more inclusive, open atmosphere. Jonathan had worked hard to make this vision a reality, but he knew that the work was far from over. There would always be challenges, both within the restaurant and in the world outside of it. But tonight, he allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The staff had risen to the occasion, proving that they could change, that they could embrace a new way of thinking, and the guests had responded in kind, rewarding the restaurant's newfound openness with their loyalty. As Jonathan walked through the restaurant, he nodded to a few familiar faces, longtime patrons who had been with him since the early days, as well as new guests who had heard about the changes and decided to give the place a try. He paused near the bar, where one of his senior waitresses, Marcy, was wiping down the counter. She looked up and smiled when she saw him. "You've done something incredible here," she said, her voice warm. "I've been in this business a long time, and I've never seen anything like it," Jonathan smiled back. Marcy had been one of the employees who had initially resisted the changes, but over the past few weeks, she had embraced them with a level of dedication that had surprised even him. She had become one of the restaurant's strongest advocates for the new policies, and her leadership had helped smooth the transition for many of the other staff members. "Thank you, Marcy," Jonathan said. "But it wasn't just me. It took all of us." Marcy nodded, her eyes shining with pride. "Still, you pushed us to be better. You made us realize that we were capable of more than we thought. I didn't always understand it at first, but now I get it. This place is special." Jonathan's smile deepened. "I'm glad you feel that way. I always believed it could be." He glanced around the room, taking in the sight of the bustling restaurant, the laughter, the smiles, the sense of community that had blossomed here. It wasn't just a restaurant anymore. It was a place where people came together, where differences were celebrated instead of being seen as barriers. The changes at the restaurant hadn't come without resistance. Some of the older staff had left, unable or unwilling to adapt to the new culture that Jonathan had implemented. But those who had stayed had embraced the transformation wholeheartedly. They had seen the value in what Jonathan was trying to build, a place where everyone felt valued and respected, regardless of their background or appearance. One of the most significant changes had been in the way the staff interacted with the guests. Under Jonathan's new policies, every employee had undergone extensive training on cultural sensitivity, unconscious bias, and customer service. It hadn't been easy at first. Some had struggled with the new expectations, feeling that their previous ways of operating had been good enough. But Jonathan had been relentless in his vision, refusing to allow mediocrity to take root in his establishment. The staff, in time, had begun to understand that the changes weren't just about business. They were about creating a better experience for everyone who walked through the door. And that understanding had translated into action. The once cold and aloof service that had characterized the restaurant had been replaced with genuine warmth and attentiveness. Guests noticed the difference, and word began to spread. The restaurant, already known for its excellent food and luxurious setting, now had something even more valuable: a reputation for treating its guests with kindness and respect. As Jonathan continued to walk through the dining room, he saw something that made him pause. A young black man, no older than 25, was sitting at a table near the window, quietly enjoying his meal. He was dressed simply, nothing that screamed wealth or status, but he looked comfortable, relaxed at home. A few years ago, Jonathan knew that this man might have been treated differently. The staff might have assumed he didn't belong, might have given him inferior service, or worse, might have found an excuse to turn him away altogether. But tonight, Jonathan saw none of that. The man's server, a new hire, a young woman who had been brought on after the restaurant's transformation, was treating him with the same level of respect and care that she gave to every guest. Jonathan watched as she refilled his water glass, asked him if he needed anything else, and smiled warmly as she attended to his needs. There was no hesitation, no judgment, no subtle discrimination, just service, just respect. Jonathan felt a swell of pride as he watched the interaction. This was what he had fought for. This was the vision he had always believed in. A restaurant where people weren't judged by their appearance, where every guest was valued, where respect was the rule, not the exception. As the evening wore on, Jonathan returned to his office. The soft hum of the restaurant's activity faded as the door closed behind him, leaving him alone in the quiet space. He sat down at his desk, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. It hadn't been easy. There had been moments when he had doubted whether the staff would ever truly embrace the changes. Moments when he had wondered if his vision was too idealistic, too far removed from the realities of the world. But tonight, as he looked back on the progress they had made, he knew it had been worth it. Jonathan opened his laptop and pulled up the latest financial reports. The restaurant's revenue had steadily increased since the implementation of the new policies, and customer satisfaction ratings were higher than they had ever been. But for Jonathan, the numbers were secondary. What mattered most was the impact they were having on people, both the staff and the guests. He clicked through the emails that had come in over the past week. One in particular caught his eye. A message from a customer who had recently dined at the restaurant for the first time. Jonathan opened the email, reading the words carefully. "Dear Mr. Price, I wanted to take a moment to thank you for the incredible experience I had at your restaurant last week. As a black man, I've grown accustomed to a certain level of indifference, or worse, when I dine at high-end establishments, but from the moment I walked through the doors of your restaurant, I felt something different. The staff treated me with respect, not because of who I am or what I was wearing, but because that's simply how they treat everyone. It was refreshing. And frankly, a little surprising. I don't know if you realize how much of a difference that makes, but for me, it was everything. I'll definitely be coming back, and I'll be telling everyone I know about the amazing experience I had. Thank you for creating a place where people like me can feel valued. Best regards, a grateful customer." Jonathan smiled as he finished reading the email. This was why he had done it. This was why the fight had been worth it. It wasn't just about creating a successful restaurant. It was about creating a space where people felt seen, where they felt respected, where they could enjoy a meal without the weight of the world's prejudices pressing down on them. He closed the laptop, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. The restaurant had become more than just a business. It had become a symbol of what was possible when people were willing to challenge the status quo, to push back against the entrenched biases that had held them back for so long. Jonathan knew that the battle wasn't over. There would always be challenges, both within the restaurant and in the world outside of it. But tonight, as he sat in his office, he allowed himself to feel proud of what they had accomplished. The road ahead might still be difficult, but they were on the right path. As the last few guests finished their meals and the restaurant staff began to clean up for the night, Jonathan stood at the window of his office, looking out over the city. The lights of the buildings glittered in the distance, and the hum of traffic below reminded him that life continued, always moving forward, always changing. The restaurant had changed. He had changed. And for the first time in a long time, Jonathan felt like they were heading in the right direction. He had come a long way from the young man who had fought tooth and nail to build his empire, only to be reminded again and again that his success would never shield him from the world's prejudices. But now, standing here, he knew that he had the power to shape the future, not just for himself, but for everyone who walked through the doors of his restaurant. The fight for respect and equality wasn't over. It might never be. But Jonathan was ready for it. He always had been. Thank you for watching to the end. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new videos. Click on the bell to stay up to date with all the updates. Also, don't forget to check out our other videos. There are many more interesting and exciting stories to come. Leave a comment where you're watching us from and share what you think. See you in the next video.